Okay. Hello, hello. Well, today I want to talk a little bit about abandonment and our development into good girls. And this fear of abandonment is something that sits very deep in many, many, many of us. And it shows up, of course, then also in, even if there was a sense of abandonment in childhood, if that is not healed, then what will happen is, of course, then we get a sense of, or there's very much a fear of abandonment in our adult life. So, there's different ways that, for many who are not familiar with the abandonment wound, it can feel very extreme. But we've got to also remember that for the when we're children, we're not developed, we're not fully developed. There's so many things we don't understand. And very often when things are happening on the outside world, we can look at it from our perspective and internalize it and make it personal about us. So for example, it could be that the sense of abandonment shows up when a parent or primary caregiver is not physically present. Now that could be because of divorce, separation, death, or other circumstances, right? And that can really impact or disturb the child's sense of safety or attachment. There's a little bit more subtle, still very powerful emotional abandonment. A parent or caregiver is physically present, but is for whatever reason emotionally unavailable to the child, or perhaps they're even neglectful towards the child's needs, let's say for love, for connection, for validation. And in situations like that, it's very easy for the child to feel unseen. There's also a perceived abandonment. Now, it could be we perceive that we are being abandoned because our caregiver or parent, their attention is diverted elsewhere, away from us. And that could be because of work, it could be because of addiction, other family members' needs, it could be because of mental challenges like depression. And then as a child, because that attention is taken away, we feel less important. It could be also something like conditional abandonment, where our parent withdraw our affection or approval when us, the child, fail to meet a certain standard of performance or behavior or appearance. So this is, of course, very strongly linked to the good girl wounding, because we feel we have to act a certain way in order to receive love and approval and connection. Now, there's also codependent abandonment, and this comes from codependency, where a parent relies overly on the child emotionally or practically to have their own needs met. So that means that the burden is placed on the child, and therefore in those moments, the child is abandoning their own needs and their own feelings in order to make the parent happy. And again, this is very linked to good girl conditioning as well. Another way of calling that is parentification, where actually the roles are switched. For whatever reason, the parent is unable to fulfill the role as an adult and a parent, and consciously or unconsciously, the child switches around with the role of the parent. And this is actually quite common. So I'm sure some of you listening to this recognizes this. I certainly know it for myself, where my mother would rely heavily on me for her emotional needs being met. And then the child, or in my case, we get overly, like almost hyper vigilant, and we're very sensitive to the parent's needs in those moments. So if you think back to your own childhood, maybe you remember times when you felt unseen, unheard, and this abandonment that I've been talking about. Now, the need to be seen and heard are so intrinsically vital for the child. And in my work over the years, I think this is one of the biggest wounds that I come across, where people didn't feel that they got heard or seen for who they really were. And so if you're not showing up perhaps as the way your parents wanted you to be, there's such a deep sense of abandonment, and that could then show up in trying to be seen or heard even more so in adult life. But I digress. So if you think back to when you were a little girl, you might have remembered, or you might remember feeling unseen, unheard. Maybe mom was depressed. Maybe dad was working too much. Maybe, in my case, my parents fought constantly. And the amount of times I just felt left so lost and forgotten, and like my needs were not important. Or it's like they know I'm here and they still don't care when I am present and they're going crazy at each other. Like I said earlier, when things are going on for your parents, we internalized those experiences. So whatever's going on for mommy or for daddy, it's actually very painful for the child to see that our parents are in pain. And to our young minds, let's imagine that if your parents could not be there for you, maybe that means that you're unlovable. And then maybe you think, okay, I have to earn love and approval. I mean, I can't risk further abandonment. And so that's for those of us that chose the mask or the role of good girl. That's when we put our good girl cape on. Yeah? And I remember being very, very young when I first put that good girl cape on. So we learn to meet others' needs. We learn to hide our feelings, maybe putting a nice brave face on or a big smile. We contort ourselves to earn validation. All this to avoid repeating that young child's sense of abandonment. But here's the paradox. Abandoning our true selves actually just breeds more loneliness. And when we're good girls, that's what we're doing. We're self-abandoning, right? We're giving up on ourselves in order for others to feel better. So, of course, the good girls, some of the very typical behaviors is people pleasing. People pleasing blocks real intimacy. If you aren't being real about your authentic feelings, that also blocks real intimacy. We say yes when we mean no, or vice versa. There's no authenticity in that, blocks intimacy again. And that can be intimacy with yourself, or that can be intimacy with others. So in playing small, in hiding ourselves and dulling our own light, we keep, although we might be keeping our loved ones near, because of course, if you're always good, that feels good for everybody else as well. But we lose our own inner sense of belonging, that very primal need that we all have. Now, the route forward is actually to start having compassion for that hurt, terrified child within. You might have heard of doing inner child work. Of course, there isn't an actual child inside of you, but there is the energy of that child, that the less healed that part of us is, the more that part of us is in the driving seat. So I liken it to kind of having, if you imagine I was to draw the silhouette of an adult, and then inside I draw a silhouette of a small child inside. Now, the bigger that child is inside, it's in the driver's seat more of the time. And vice versa, if you've managed to get it to a really small part of you, which is really where I find myself, then it's still there, but it's just less in the driver's seat. It's less driving your reactions to life. So it's also important to recognize how that desire for approval, we think it's protecting us from feeling abandoned and unworthy, but then actually there's never any room for us to really sense into who we really are and how we really feel and what's really true for us moment to moment. So it really takes courage, it takes you to really work on this part, to move more towards worthiness. Each time we speak up authentically, each time we ask for support, admit that we're struggling or we can't do anything perfectly, or ask to be put first, to be placed first, either ask yourself or ask others. The latter, of course, is a little bit more complex, but even just the step of putting yourself first, for many of us, that requires a great deal of courage if you've been wearing the good or mask long enough. Because of course, if that fear of losing others isn't going to disappear overnight. But we need to step into our vulnerability, and that can feel really challenging. So there's actually, let me there, many years ago, it's probably about 22 years ago when I first had my first therapy session. And I won't forget it because I had like these knots in my stomach as I walked into the session room. And, I'd made it, I was pretty much perfected this showing up as, I'm perfectly fine. How are you? Fine, good. My whole life. Never letting anybody see my shame, insecurity, sadness, also rage. But at 30 years old, this combination of relentless people pleasing and stifled emotions and this pain in my jaw from smiling when I didn't feel like smiling had left me pretty depleted, exhausted, and numb. So when I was sitting there in the therapy room, my heart was racing. But I then heard myself admitting that I felt lost, worthless, alone. And over the years, especially in that moment, but sort of over the years, being able to, through the therapist, receive unconditional care and understanding in the midst of deep shame for taking off this mask. And over many, many difficult but freeing sessions that has gone over years really, I reconnected with the buried emotion, discovered just how profoundly I had abandoned myself, my voice, my truth, my authenticity, just to secure others' love. So I think the biggest step I've taken is actually to get support and not having to do this journey on my own. And so I'd love to hear from you in the chat here. What is what's coming up for you as I share my own story, but also that of this very, very deep wound of abandonment. A work in progress, I would say, for those of us that really dug deep into this sense of that we're not worthy, that we've got to put others ahead of our own sense of self, our own needs, wants, values, everything. So I hope you took away some valuable insights from this video, and I'd love to hear what those were. From my heart to yours, have a beautiful rest of your day. Bye for now.